Hello. Once again, I come to you from Anderson University to consider some of the falsehoods and inaccuracies being spread about the end of the Gospel of Mark, Mark 16, 9 through 20. W.R. Telford writes on page 144 that a second ending is the so-called longer ending, Mark 16, 9 through 20, which is present in the King James Version, but lacking in our oldest manuscripts, as well as from all Greek manuscripts known to Eusebius and Jerome. That is a lie. Both Eusebius and Jerome had copies of Mark that included verses 9 through 20. As we have seen in another video, Eusebius quotes from verse 9 and recommends to his correspondent Marinus to include the passage with a pause after the word rising in verse 9. Telford writes, "It is not attested in Greek manuscripts of the New Testament before the 5th century. Its early attestation is by Irenaeus." Now, why he argues from the oldest manuscripts and yet still says Irenaeus had it in his is basically a tacit admission that it was in Irenaeus' manuscript of Mark in the 100s. So the fact that the earliest manuscripts are Sinaiticus and Vaticanus is simply an accident of history, because the age of a manuscript has more to do with how it was preserved than how accurate its text is. An early manuscript can still have a terrible text. Let's consider what William Barclay wrote. He said, "The verses which follow, that is, Mark 16 through 20, are not in any of the great early manuscripts." That is a lie. For that to be true, the only great manuscripts would be Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, because all the rest of them have it. He says it is only later and inferior manuscripts which contain them. Again, we have over 1,650 manuscripts of Mark's Gospel. Irenaeus in the 100s had verses 9 through 20 in his copies. Irenaeus expresses no doubt at all about this passage. Now, Irenaeus, born in Asia Minor, worked in Rome, was bishop in Lyon, France, Gaul. Why we should listen to a manuscript from the 300s, which is what Vaticanus and Sinaiticus are, as opposed to Irenaeus' manuscript, which he quoted from in the 100s, is rather mysterious. Why do we hear about Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, but hardly ever from Irenaeus in our Bible footnotes? Why don't we see in the ESV a reference to Irenaeus quoting chapter 16, verse 19? We should. So, W.R. Telford, William Barclay, and others have spread a whole lot of misinformation. Another book that spreads misinformation is here. You would think that Darrell Bock would be up to date. But in his chapter, which comes after the other writers, Daniel Wallace, Keith Elliott, Reese Robinson, David Allen Black, of these four, Robinson and Black advocate to include the passage in the text. But Darrell Bock writes the following. Now, by the way, I was at the symposium where these gentlemen spoke, and I would say that at every point, Darrell Bock was simply being Dan Wallace's wingman. Let's look closely at what Darrell Bock claims about Mark 16 and 20. Excuse me while I find the passage, while I find where his chapter begins. I know I should have this all set up before. Darrell Bock says, or writes, here we are. Page 124, Bock's segment begins. He says, the variants we possess for the short and longer endings of Mark are both very old. In real life, the oldest evidence of Mark ending at 16:8 comes to us from Eusebius, when he says what he says to Marinus, which I discussed in another video. Irenaeus, just a martyr, the anonymous author of Epistle Apostolorum, and the preaching of Peter, considered G.T. Atkins' recent analysis. Bock doesn't seem to be aware of either Epistle Apostolorum or the preaching of Peter. But he does say something about we need to connect the dots. I would certainly agree. But first, we have to have the dots to connect. Those dots consist of external evidence that Bock does not handle very well. After he critiques William Pickering, he says we should be careful to make a brittle fundamentalism. Well, I would caution Darrell Bock about creating a brittle skepticism. He says on page 128, fully 85% of the manuscripts we have come from the 11th century and beyond. So we need to pay attention to when manuscripts appear with evidence. To do this, we can look not only at the extant evidence of manuscripts, but also the evidence from the Church Fathers quoting from their manuscripts. A manuscript quoted extensively by a Church Father is just as valid as one that is extant from that time. That's how we can trace the spread of readings. Bock says the external evidence is that when it comes to Greek manuscripts, we have the two major Alexandrian full manuscripts, Aleph, attesting to the shorter ending. We also have 304. Now, caution, when he uses the term shorter ending, he doesn't really use it right. He's referring to the abrupt ending. He says, geographic distribution is important when you turn to the versional evidence. There's yet another ending present which gives evidence that verses 9 through 20 was lacking. It is known as the intermediate ending. Now, by intermediate ending, he's referring to what everyone else calls the shorter ending. He writes, the short ending at verse 8 is present in the Armenian, and then he says, in parentheses, Caesarean or early Byzantine. Now, first, Darrell Bock, we should all know the Armenian is Byzantine. Why he says it's Caesarean or early Byzantine, I have no idea. He writes, this version, that is the Syriac, is especially difficult to treat because its early history is mediated through the Diatessaron. True. He says the Curetonian, however, is probably a later edition. Also true. However, there's other Syriac writings to consider. For instance, the writings of Aphrahat, which he never does mention. Probably doesn't even know it exists. Aphrahat, in his demonstration 1, chapter 17, quotes from Mark 16 and 20. So, Darrell Bock, why didn't you mention this when you mention external evidence? You leave things out. That is part of the problem with only getting the story from Darrell Bock. You're only getting part of the story. He writes, the old Latin K, that is Bobbiensis, also lacks the ending, offering the intermediate addition to the short ending noted above. Now, what he doesn't say is, in Bobbiensis, we have, not only do we have the shorter ending after Mark 16:8, also we have verse 8 edited by a scribe who leaves out part of it. In Bobbiensis, we have, between verse 3 and 4, additional an interpolation, which gives us an ascension right there. So in Bobbiensis, we have a tampered manuscript, in other words. Again, Bobbiensis, when you see the word Bobbiensis, think its text of Mark has been tampered with and corrupted. Not in a casual way, a benign way, but in a way that introduces new material into the text. That is not a careless scribal mistake, but an intentional corruption. Bock says, in addition, the earliest Byzantine lectionaries lacked the longer ending. Wrong. You can go to my blog and see an early lectionary and see that it very clearly includes verses 9 through 20. Bock says the longer ending starts to appear in the 8th century. Wrong. That's simply a lie. Well, in academic language, Darrell Bock, you don't know what you're talking about. So he says, we're dealing with more than A, Aleph, and B? Yes, we also have manuscript 304, which, if you read the Evangelical Textual Criticism blog, you'll see that, and search for 304, you'll see that it has been affirmed by both Tommy Wasserman and Hugh Carlton. This is not an actual, authentic confirmation of the abrupt ending at verse 8. This is simply a crook manuscript, possibly made as the first half of a 2-part volume, in which case, if the second half had survived, we would see the shorter ending in the second half. We only have the part that is Matthew and Mark. We don't know where Luke and John is. Probably doesn't exist anymore. So he says, the fathers, in my judgment, are extremely important for this case. You would think he would give a little bit more detail about how abundant the church fathers are then. Does he mention Aphrahat? No. Does he mention Epistula Apostolorum? No. Now, remember, Epistula Apostolorum, that is a reference before 145. That is very early. To fail to mention that is kind of inexcusable, Dr. Bock, if you're going to be saying that the fathers are extremely important for this case. Instead of being thorough, you focus and zoom in on Eusebius and Jerome, but at the same time, keep Jerome and Eusebius at a distance so you can't actually see what they say. Why not simply present Eusebius and Jerome and give us exactly what they say to the correspondence, that is, to Marinus and to Hedibiam? But you say, Dr. Bock, both note that the bulk of Greek manuscripts they were aware of did not possess the longer ending. That is not all they say. Again, you have to look into the text of Ad Marinum and see that Eusebius frames this as something someone could say. For his own part, when he writes his response to Marinus, Eusebius quotes Mark 16:9, so obviously it's in his copies, at least some of them, and he recommends to Marinus how to include the passage in public reading. Put a pause in verse 9 after the word rising, anastas. That is not how you say, don't include this. And though, of course, Eusebius is a bishop, he could have told Marinus, I tell you, Marinus, you shouldn't have this passage. That's not what he does. Again, that is not what Eusebius said. Likewise, Jerome. When Jerome made the Vulgate, he included verses 9 to 20. So whatever he says about majority, that can be a majority that he ignores because he has better manuscripts. As we are so fond of saying, you don't simply count. You make a judgment call. And when Eusebius and Jerome made their judgment calls, they had the passage in their text. Jerome put it in the Vulgate. Eusebius quotes it in his writings to Marinus. But also, Darrell Bock says, both note the bulk of Greek manuscripts they were aware of did not possess a longer ending. That's not quite what Jerome says. He says, and you can read my book for details, almost hardly any Greek manuscripts contain this passage. And yet, when it comes to how he wants Hedibiam to treat the passage, Jerome instructs her to do just the same thing that Eusebius told Marinus to do. You must keep the passage and read it with a pause. That's not how a person rejects the passage. A person who wants his correspondent to not accept the passage as scripture would say, hey, correspondent, don't use this passage as scripture. You don't say, read it with a pause. You say, don't read it. So again, when you read Dr. Bock, read him with a grain of salt. He does, though, acknowledge that Irenaeus was the first to give clear evidence for the longer reading among the fathers, and 10 fathers from the 2nd to 5th centuries cited the text. Well, he's wrong with both statements. The Epistula Apostolorum and Justin are earlier than Irenaeus, and so is Tatian. So his claim, Irenaeus was the first to give clear evidence, wrong. Irenaeus gives explicit evidence because Irenaeus specifically names Mark as the author of verse 19. And when he says 10 fathers from the 2nd to 5th century cited the text, he's only wrong by a factor of 4. It's more like 40 fathers from the 2nd to 5th centuries cited the text. So again, Dr. Bock considers internal evidence more important than the external evidence, but when he's taking the external evidence into account, he himself, in writing this, is not even seeing the whole picture. There's a whole bunch of evidence he does not seem to have been aware of when he wrote his chapter in this book. So please, if you read this book as something to read in your research on Mark 16 and 9 to 20, recognize that Darrell Bock has not done his homework. And that's all for today. Thank you for listening.